Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And thanks a lot to both Vincent as well as Cyril Cosme for inviting me today to talk to you all. I'll just share my presentation. Yeah. As Vincent said very rightly, what I'm going to talk to you about is artificial intelligence. What are the promises and threats for the future of work? I want to take up something that Cyril talked about, that the future of work is not something that is given, and it is much more about how we actually shape it and how we could take informed way of moving forward through some of the joint decisions. And that's actually the centrality of the ILO, which is a tripartite organization and which believes in social dialogue. So given the fact that there is a resurgence of a lot of interest in AI, especially after the last decade of a lot of talk on automation and how job losses are going to happen, I think the same narrative again comes back with the AI. And there's not really so much of focus on how the AI development takes place, but much more about how some of the Gen AI is going to take away many of the jobs. So what I've decided to do today is take you through two trends. The first trend is about the development of AI and the invisible workers who actually power the AI tools and products within the AI supply chains. And the second trend is much more about the algorithmic management practices, which use either AI tools or automated decision-making processes at regular workplaces, which has risks for the workers. And somehow Cyril was touching on both of them. And I think I'm going to dive a bit more deeper and take you through these two trends and then talk through some of the policy issues that need to be considered as we move forward. So when we think about development of AI, I don't think there's much thought about how these AI systems are actually developed. And also the understanding that there are a number of invisible workers who are actually engaged in that process. This is work done by Paula Tubaro and colleagues who are based in Paris. And what they very nicely show in this particular figure is that how there is an AI preparation process that happens where a lot of data that is generated is actually annotated by workers all around the world. Now, there's a lot of talk about data the minute you get into AI and the machine learning systems, but nobody understands that the data that you get is not something that is curated, not something that is organized. And for this purpose, it becomes very important for one to look at data annotation. Only once the data is annotated and clean that it can be used for modeling and you come up with machine learning algorithms. And once you have some of the results coming out of those machine learning algorithms, you still need to verify it. And this is again done by humans in the process. So very clearly you see that in the development of AI, you have two ends, the AI preparers and the AI verifiers who are invisible workers. And what you know about the AI system being developed are largely the computer scientists who are involved in the modeling of these models and algorithms, and that is what is much well known. Now, who are the workers who are supplied for invisible work? They come from two main areas, micro-task platforms or contact centers. And many of these workers are actually based in developing countries. And you have also the SaaS providers, that is software as a service, that has come up with some of the semi-automatic annotation through call centers, but it's still not developed to a stage where it can be automatically done. Now, I'm going to run through 4 different AI systems that we have. And in each of the systems, I'll try to give you some examples so that you understand what we are talking about when we talk about AI systems and development. Now, this is an example from Appen. It is no longer available upon the Appen website since I first presented this particular graph or picture on one of my presentations, but we saved it and it is from our archives from February this year. It says that they provide a lot of data solutions, whether it's generative AI to search engines, content moderations, autonomous vehicles, and all of that. And they very clearly say that the AI lifecycle service core is the use case of raw data, which is further transformed into data preparation by a number of workers, and then that is used for model evaluation. And they say that their platform is capable of providing a whole range of these services. And we'll get into some of these in the examples. And what's interesting is they talk about providing this kind of a service for more than 200 plus languages. Now, one would assume that, wow, there's an AI system that exists, everything is in a loop, everything works very well. And, we are having AI solutions today for many of the problems that we have. And, we can have an autonomous vehicle just using some of this AI system. And they do talk about the delivery model, which is very interesting. They talk about an app and secure workforce, an app and crowd, and they also talk about the client internal teams, that is the teams of the clients with whom they work. Further, this particular website also goes about saying that they have a global crowd of about 1 million workers from 170 countries with so many languages. And these workers actually include students, professionals, parents, PhDs, veterans, educators, everybody who's involved in it. So this gives you a sort of a picture already that an AI system or an AI lifecycle services involves a whole range of workers to actually boost this AI system and to get it moving. Now, let me take the example of autonomous vehicle first. Now, there's a lot of talk about it, a lot of benefits, a lot of promises that are there about how we are moving into a world where vehicles will be quite autonomous. Probably this is a reality for the global north. I doubt whether this would be a reality for the global south, because I don't see, coming from India, I don't see any of my cities having autonomous vehicles, given the kind of traffics that we have. But even for this autonomous vehicle, you do need data labeling to be done. That is the annotation. Then that data has to be curated. And then there's a model evaluation or a machine learning algorithm that is taken into consideration. And then that leads to autonomous vehicle. Now, what we also know in many of the areas is, while you have much of it autonomous, there's also a control mechanism where many of them are actually monitored and controlled from distant locations. I'm not going to talk about that, but I'm going to dive in more into autonomous vehicles. Now, in reality, how do vehicles become autonomous? Very clearly, they rely on machine learning algorithms, as I mentioned before. But these algorithms, they require large data sets. Now, these raw data sets could be images, videos, audios, or text, which is annotated through tools which are specifically designed for data annotation to identify what are the attributes, and they add to the metadata of any particular situation, picture, or whatsoever. Now, all of this work is not done by autonomous vehicle manufacturers within the companies. Rather, they outsource these tasks for image classifications. And also, these image classifications can include a whole range of things, from pedestrians to dogs to traffic lights or other vehicles. So on the right-hand side, what you see very clearly is a worker basically has to either tag what they are and accordingly also do bounded boxes, which is called as semantic segmentation. And this can be done either using 2D or 3D things. So these data annotators actually transform the raw data into the training data. And that is, this data then can then be encoded into a machine learning model. And that's how autonomous vehicles come into force. Now, the second example is part of it also requires some sort of a categorization, landmarking, and polygon. These are just examples to show how it's done. Also for autonomous vehicles, but it's also done for Web 2.0 and other tools. The first one is categorization of products for actually the e-commerce platforms, where when you go on and you're looking for a particular product, you find everything organized very well, categorized very well. Now, you might assume that it's an algorithm that does it, but in reality, no. There are humans behind actually training and doing it in person. And similarly, for facial recognition, you have to do a lot of plotting. This is in the terminology of annotation called as landmarking, where you plot the eyes, the nose, the mouth, all the other characteristics of a human being is concerned. And similarly, there's a term used for as polygon for landmarks, where you're marking the land to identify what they are. The third example I want to show is that of content moderation. I think all of us do know that when you get on to the Web 2.0, you don't find any objectionable material. And part of the thing that you think is, oh, well, there's AI, there's algorithm that actually takes care of it. But again, the reality is far from that. There might be some things that are automated, like the YouTube CEO way back in 2017 went about saying that, 95% of it is automated. But what he failed to tell us is that as 5% of it is not automated, all of this is actually looked by humans. So big tech companies do not actually do that internally. They actually outsource the moderation of the content to developing countries as part of the CSR initiatives and as part of the narrative of reducing poverty, creating employment, and reducing inequality. And this is, of course, taken over by developing countries because there's a big issue of unemployment there. And companies are also vying for trying to come up with what are the new areas where they can expand. So in one of the BPO companies in India, we found that they had a poster outside their company which says, we act as a firewall or a gatekeeper or a watchdog for the internet. And, workers really feel committed to it. And it's like, yeah, we are actually helping a big social cause, and we are trying to ensure that these materials are not there on the web. But I think what was quite shocking for us to look at was that 90% of these workers who are looking at content moderation, cleaning it, are actually graduates and postgraduates with engineering and computer science skills. And I just want you to note that, and I'll come back to it in a minute. And these workers sift through thousands of such images and take decisions based on instructions provided to them. Now, in another study, we also found that almost all workers have recounted experiences of watching many of these instances and having psychological distress and having an impact on their health conditions. Some of the arguments that are put forward, well, it clearly helps people who use the Web 2.0 to have something very neat and clean, and you're not looking at all this material. But what you ignore is what happens to workers who are actually going about cleaning the web. And there's a fantastic documentary that's been done by two Germans called Cleaners, which they did it based in Philippines. And there, a number of workers said that they have seen hundreds of beheadings during the process of their work and the impact that it has. Now, there's also this argument that exists that, well, this is a temporary phenomena or a transition phenomena. The algorithms will be developed and much of this work will go away. But it was interesting to see that the Google Transparency Report of 2023 went about saying that human reviewers or content moderators play a very important role for Google in its content moderation. And they very clearly also say that algorithms cannot always tell the difference between hate speech and provocative comedy. And similarly, they give more examples to show how it is very difficult for many of these things that are coming up to be identified by algorithm and to remove it from the web. And we also know the story from ChatGPT OpenAI, which is another frontier where toxicity was being opened. Again, the narrative is much more around fears of generative AI and augmentation automation. But I think what's missing in this debate, again, is a focus on invisible workers in moderating the content of generative AI. And I think what's missed out is that this is not just the Web 2.0, but there's a lot of dark web where a lot of data from there is being cleaned. And it begs the question of more moral and ethical considerations, whether this is a way we should be developing AI systems. And I'm very thankful to Billy Perigo of Times Magazine for actually bringing out this story to light, which has led to a lot of work around this area, especially in Kenya. And what he found was that workers were paid less than $2 per hour, and our surveys further show how workers get only half of what even Bill Perigo finds, and I'll get to that in a minute. The second area I do want to talk about is AI-driven products, such as robot vacuum cleaners. We all think, wow, the robotics has come in, it can identify a lot of things around your house, or if you have a robotics to mow your lawn, that it would find how the mowing goes on. And we always think this is all algorithms, mathematics, computer scientists know it. What we know very less about is that there's a feeding mechanism that goes into it. And this was again a study done by colleagues from Paris, a DIPLAB, where they found that one of the micro workers, when you ask them what is the task they do, he went about saying that he spent 2 days actually moving her dog's poop and took more than 250 programs to basically train data for vacuum cleaners. So this begs the question, what kind of an automation are we talking about? Surely there's a promise, but surely there's also a risk with it, right? Are we really understanding how many of these automated products or automated tools are actually coming back? The third that I want to touch upon is a virtual assistant, which is an AI-powered tool for essential secretarial services. This is part of the work that we did for the WESO 2021 report. And it was super interesting to find that there was this AI-powered tool for secretarial services, because many of us don't like to manage our agenda. And we're like, I wish there was a tool that was available which could take care of it. So surely 3 young people came up with this fantastic idea that, oh, well, let's have an AI-powered tool to do this task. And they were actually very successful to raise an investment of about $11 million in 2014, just with a page of their proposal. And what they said was that they would have a scheduling services that coordinates when, where, and how candidates meet the recruiters and interviewers, and also to schedule your calendar. And then they also came up with subscription packages from $99 to $399, and a lot of people actually bought it. And the company was started working very well. What very few people know is that there was absolutely no AI-powered tool or no automation initially. In the phase 1, it was exclusively done by humans, that is the 3 of them, sitting in a little apartment in San Francisco with an email ID where all the clients would send a mail to that email. And then these 3 people would go about actually scheduling all the interviews, scheduling or managing the agenda and all of it. And it's over a period of time that they developed this tree and tried to get the human-machine interaction. And they started outsourcing a lot of these works to Upwork and other microtask platforms and freelance platforms, and then also tried to get workers designated from certain countries to work with them. Even today, this particular AI-powered tool actually works in a human-in-loop approach. And what was very nice is after the interview was done, after 2 or 3 sittings, the particular person went about changing their title on their page, saying it's not an AI-powered tool, but it's a human-powered tool. So I thought at least there was a message that came out. But I think what was shocking was that the company was sold for $345 million in 2019. So this actually raises a fundamental question about what is AI and how much of human intervention is there when we talk about AI, and the whole question around fake AI. And there are lots of such products that have come into force. And the last example I want to give in this context is the automated surveillance or security system tools. And this is an interesting system that is being used extensively in a number of supermarkets in France. And what was very shocking is that all that they were using CCTVs to monitor the stores remotely. And many of these workers were sitting in Madagascar, probably in India, because Amazon has, again, a checkout store. And we found out that there were a lot of Indian workers who were actually looking through what the items are being picked and then trying to bill many of the customers. And the issue is there's no AI actually. And it's very clearly mentioned by this worker who says, for me, it's like surveillance, like being a guard or a security agent from a distance to prevent all kinds of thefts that can happen in the store. So this begs the question as to, what AI are we talking about? Isn't it time for us to look at what AI systems are we talking? Now, this has huge implications for labor. Now, this is through the survey that we did in 2017, where we found that many of these workers are very highly educated, especially in developing countries. They have either bachelor's or postgraduate. And I think what's more shocking is they are trained in specialized fields of medicine, IT, engineering, and also economics or other social sciences. And this is about 58% of them are alone in the STEM fields. And we also did country studies, and we found similar trends in both Kenya and in India. Now, the task that they do is very close to what I've been talking about. That is verification, content moderation, categorization, data collection and annotation, translation and transcription. And if you look at the average, median, or mean hourly earnings, you find that for all of the AI tasks, it's about $2. And you find that 50% of the workers actually earn only around $1 per hour. And part of the reason is because of rejection, and there's no communication channels that exist on these platforms. And because it's not that you have a computer and you open it up and tasks are going to come by. There, you have to actually search for tasks. And there's a lot of unpaid labor time that goes into it. And this was about 1/3 of their time. Now, we also in the country studies looked at AI BPO companies to see what their education profile was. It was very similar, as I said, and we looked at what their earnings was. And it was quite shocking to see that it is half of that of what summer workers were getting in Kenya, which was reported by Billy Perigo. It was only $0.90 per hour for both AI training and annotation. And between the men and women, the proportions were almost similar. And in India, we looked at monthly earnings as well as the hourly earnings, and we found that the hourly earnings was again only around $2. And if you look at the monthly earnings, for the kind of education that they have, it is far, far lower than what they should be earning. And this is not even enough for you to have a family and to have a decent life. Now, I think the reason I show you in dollars is to show that anything that you touch upon, it's only around $400. So this is very cheap for companies that are based in the US, where for $4,000, if that's the pay you would give to a worker in the US, you're going to actually get about 10 workers in India. And probably in Kenya, you would get 20 workers. And that's also the reason why it's being pushed into these economies, because it's cheap labor and you can actually fool them. Now, there are also moral and ethical considerations about this development, which is supported by invisible workers, as they have poor working conditions. And they are already creating a sweatshop of educated digital labor, something that we know from the garment industry and other home-based worker industries from the turn of the last century. And using invisible workers to remove toxic content, as I mentioned earlier, has huge psychological impacts. Now, there has been some preliminary responses, but a lot more needs to be done with regard to how to actually handle some of these issues that are coming up. I want to end this first trend by raising some of the issues, especially within the context of a global economy and also within the context of a developing economy, as to what all of this means for structural transformation of developing economies, but also what it means for societal development in many of these countries. Because you see new digital jobs that are coming up, but none of these jobs are actually leading to high-skilled sectors of either the services or the manufacturing, but they are much more trending towards low-end, low-skill services sector. And many of these BPO companies also, there's a big issue around employment relationship, income instability, lack of access to work. And you would have expected that many of these workers would have social protection benefits and other work-related benefits, and we do not really find it. There are gains, there are promises surely for those in the global north than in the south, and even among high-end workers in the global south, where surely Gen AI helps certain types of workers to improve their productivity. But I think the question is at what cost? And it's also an issue that it is creating new kinds of exploitation and inequalities. And the larger question is, what does all this mean for the development process of both economic and social issues within the developing countries, and whether there's a diffusion or spillover effects as a result of it? I'll stop here with this first trend and then talk to you about my second trend, which is about algorithmic management practices in the regular workplaces. I think the minute we talk about algorithmic management, all our attention goes to digital labor platforms. Very clearly, it's been popularized there to manage dispersed workforce. And what algorithmic management actually means is it's a use of algorithm and data-driven systems to make decisions, to allocate resources, and to manage workflows. So within the platforms, this was used to allocate and direct, to monitor the workers, and to evaluate and discipline, which had implications on access to work, instability in incomes, and deactivation of accounts. Now, what is really little known is that actually algorithmic management predates digital labor platforms. And especially so if you look at the evolution of technologies, because they resemble quite a bit today's algorithmic management. And I want to give two examples related to it, and some others we'll go into the case studies that I'll talk about. I think, and there's one more point that I do want to make is some of these earlier technologies that came up, they were being used for traceability of goods. And today what is being done is the same tools, improvised a bit more, are used for tracing the workers. That's one of the biggest differences that you actually see. The second thing I want to say is that within the manufacturing sector, especially the automobile sector, which is actually a front runner in the development of technologies, you had computer integrated manufacturing way back in the mid-70s, which enabled computers to control machinery, to monitor both goods and people in a way. And you can see the first workings of many of these systems today that we have actually put in place. And part of the reason is also because there was a lot of subcontracting that was happening across the globe. The second area, again, where you see that coming up is within the call centers, where you had the lead firm within the global north, that is either the US or the UK, and you had a lot of workers largely then in India and Philippines, which is where a lot of BPO call center work was being done. And they somehow felt that, well, how do we control the work that is happening in these locations, and how do we actually monitor? And this is what led to getting computers networked and connected between the two parts of the world. And they started introducing right then in the 90s employee performance monitoring through these tools, where they would actually listen to what the worker is saying and then give feedbacks, first as training and then as performance monitoring things. And I think the two other things I do want to say is that within the logistics sectors, you had the ERP, that is the enterprise resource planning coming in, and within the healthcare, you had the hospital information system coming in, again, way back in the 80s and the 90s. And today they have transformed and taken a completely different form at the regular workplaces. We looked at a number of sectors for the study that ILO has been conducting. Initially, it was started with a collaboration with the Joint Research Center, where we looked at logistics and healthcare in France and Italy, as well as in India and South Africa. And subsequently, the ILO took up more work in retail in Chile, automobile manufacturing in Argentina and Malaysia, and electronics manufacturing in Malaysia, and banking in Chile. And what we tried focusing here is on the work management and coordination in the shop floor, or a particular department or subsector if it was a healthcare. And we followed a case study approach as a method. One thing I'd like to say is that the minute you move from a digital labor platform to a regular workplace, the nature of tools that you actually use, it increases. And it is very important for us then to broaden the conceptual thinking around what is an automated decision-making process or an algorithmic management within that particular workplace. Like, it is not just the computer program procedures, but it is also the specific purpose technology that is used and also the general purpose technologies that are used to manage work. Like, for example, you can look at WhatsApp group or CCTVs or smartwatches, which are all general purpose technologies, but they do exert some sort of a control or pressure over the workers as a result of it. And what we also argue is that there are technologies that are probably not explicitly designed for work management or coordination functions, but they have completely other intended purposes, but they could also have implications on the organization of work and digital monitoring. For instance, when you look at the algorithms that have come in to manage patient flows in healthcare, they can surely improve patient outcomes, but it can also affect organization of work and has the potential of work monitoring and also increased workload and stress for many of the workers. Now, if you look at the sectors that we are looking at, there are lots of tools that are there. But I think what's important to keep in mind is that it's a combination of specific purpose technology, management systems, and the general purpose technology, which exert the kind of control that we are talking about and have implications on the workers. You'll have the slides so you can look at it in detail. Now, let me go to one of the sectors and most of you know. That is the logistics sector. And I'm just picking certain parts of the logistics sector. There's a lot more that is there in our studies, but this is just to illustrate how the management practices are changing within these logistic companies as a result of it. So when you're talking about picking and packing, there are lots of tools that are there, right? You have the handheld scanner, you have the conveyor belt, you have the wearable devices, you have the AGVs. That is the automated vehicle, guided vehicles. Now, I think what is very important is many of these tools might have been there before. But the difference is that today, as they are connected to different systems, that is the enterprise resource planning to data management, transport management, and warehouse management, there's a lot of data collection that happens, which leads to both the traceability of the good and the worker. So you have an automated guided vehicle, which actually helps to optimize directions and also takes away a lot of physical load and physical tasks. But what it does is it sets a pace and a rhythm. So a worker has to actually do that work within the time that he's given. And if he doesn't, then this is recorded. And then there is some sort of a training initially, but over a period of time, there is some sort of a punishment that takes place and disciplinary action that takes place. So the pace that is set has implications on the work intensification and stress. This is the same when we are talking about delivery, that is the GPS directions or parking assistants or handles scanners, where you have a lot of these tools which are also monitoring the workers. So there's a fear psychosis that is built in, and the workers fear not to make any mistakes because they know that if they do make mistakes, there would be repercussions as a result of it. So the real-time traceability actually leads to increases the accountability that is there. And all of this information is then used for performance evaluation. And what we have also seen is that if this kind of an information is just used for resource allocation, that's fine. But this is often used for staffing of workers. And sometimes the workers are given a very short notice through instant WhatsApp message being told that, well, you have to come up to this shift this afternoon, or, your shift is coming to an end earlier than what was you were supposed to do. And workers have no choice but to actually leave. And this has implications on their incomes. And we also see a shift from permanent workforce to temporary workforce within this particular sector, depending upon the country that one is talking about. The second one I want to touch upon is the automobile manufacturing. And again, here, I'm only touching one part, that is the assembly line. I think what was very interesting here is that normally when you're in an assembly line, an operator basically knows that towards a corner, that's where there is a place where all the parts are being put up. And he goes and picks up these parts and actually goes about then doing the assembly. Now, what has happened is they have introduced automated guided vehicles again within the assembly line. So the operator remains where he is. So he doesn't have to go up and down the shop floor to get his parts. And that is provided to him. But at the same time, he is required not only to do that, but to do a number of other multiple tasks. And again, the AGVs go about setting the pace and rhythm. Now, he has to do it within the time that is allocated. So what they are trying to do is they're trying to tighten further the just-in-time dynamics, because within the automobile manufacturing, compared to the other sectors, the motivation to get into automation and automated decision process is much more quality control and just-in-time process than anything else. Efficiency is built into some of these parameters. The second thing that you see is the quality control aspect of electronic work instructions. Now, this is an industry which has always had work instructions, and the difference is it was there in a paper stuck on their board, but now it's electronic. It decides how much time it takes to do it. Again, there is a pace and rhythm that is set to minimize errors. But if there is a mistake, there's a red flag that goes up and the entire process has to be repeated. Now, all of this, the fear of not being able to make a mistake, leads to quite a bit of stress among the workers. And in some factories, we've also seen that they have introduced a poker yoke system, where if there is an error, then the machine automatically stops. It's excellent in a way. But the problem is that all of these mistakes are recorded through the different systems that they have. Data is collected, and then there is a performance evaluation, and there's a disciplinary action that is taken. So you find that in many of them, there are different types of surveillance that is there, from barcodes, QR codes, that the worker has to get that particular product, to CCTVs that actually monitor, to new sensors. But what's very interesting, in one of the factories in Malaysia, we found is that there was no sensor that was there, but there was a barcode and CCTV. So when there was a faulty part that was coming out, they could easily figure out through the barcode, you knew the ID of the product. And through that, you knew what time that product had passed, and you could look at the CCTV footage and then take disciplinary action against that particular worker. So it's quite scary to see the extent to which surveillance has penetrated within the sectors. The third and the last example I have is the healthcare sector, which one would expect is completely, the level of automation would be very different. Yes, it is, but to an extent when it comes to workers, that is, both the high-end professionals, doctors, as well as nurses, some of the things that are being introduced are quite worrisome, not only from the point of view of the workers per se, but also from the point of view of patient care that is required. Now, HIS is something that was introduced, I guess, much more earlier in the US and other developed countries, way back in the 80s by the government, as more as a trial process. And it has billing and electronic health records and laboratory modules being systematically brought in over the past decades. And today you find these systems quite well developed, and they are also existing in many of the hospitals within the developing countries. But I think what is very new that has come up is the Gen AI report writing or replies. And this is something we see again emerging in the US, not from our case studies, but very important to highlight that many of the doctors are asking their patients when they see them whether they can use Gen AI to record and actually take the reporting. And this leads to questions around data privacy, but it also leads to questions around how much is a doctor then recording about what the patient is going through. And there's the second narrative that is coming up saying that nurses have too much of overload of work. So can we use the Gen AI to respond to the patient mails? And can we actually use it? And here again, experiments in the US have shown that, well, some of the responses are not good at all. And the nurses have to not only change, but they have to relook and they spend more time. But the question is that where you should be even using Gen AI per se? Now, an area where a lot has improved as a result of both HIS and predictive algorithms is more transparency, more faster responses, improved resource allocation, and a good management, especially when you have emergencies and all of that. And they have also created a lot of jobs for data entry operators in many of the countries because they're not digitized and you have to digitize them. But many of this that has come in, they do distract from patient care and raise issues around data privacy. And I think an area which is very worrisome is around the telemedicine platforms that have come in, where it's much more driven by productivity rather than anything else. And how much a doctor is going to be paid is based on how quickly are you able to resolve the patient's disease through more intensive visits and all of it. But there's also the other side of it. They might get more money, but it increases their workload and stress. And there's also constant monitoring and surveillance that is there. And the more developed these systems are, you also see how hospitals are changing the whole patient care by having more monitoring and surveillance on the doctors. Like in one of the Indian private hospitals, we found that the board of directors had decided to introduce a dashboard to collect data on doctors. How are they coming up with a diagnosis? What is the dosage then? What is the time they spend with the patient? What is the cost? What is the kind of medicaments that they are trying to give? And they not only evaluate that doctor over a period of time, but also compare it with other doctors. Now, as of now, the doctors are not even aware that such a system is happening. But the point is that if you do not have regulations, this would literally have perverse impacts on many of the professional community, which is something very less known of than the workers at the lower end of the realm. But also it raises fundamental questions about how patient care is happening. And here I'd just like to note that it's also interesting to see how general purpose technology like WhatsApp being used, but there are no safeguards and there is big issues around patient data privacy that is there. Now, well, there's no social dialogue or consultation that exists in many of these sectors and case studies that we have seen. Lack of awareness, low levels of trade unions, irrespective of the countries that we are talking about. The only exception was a French public hospital, and our guess is it's largely because of high degrees of unionization, which tried to mitigate negative consequences. But apart from that, in no other country did we find that there is a consultative process right from the bottom to introduce these technologies. So moving forward, there are three areas that I'd like to highlight, and with that, I'll conclude. how do you actually go about balancing efficiency and labor rights and reducing the harms that many of these AI actually bring out? I think the first thing I'd like to say is about the limits to AI and algorithmic management practices. When I think about limits to AI, I think it's about what are the kind of AI systems, AI tools are we talking about? And this would require very clearly auditing AI firms for ethical AI development and for ensuring that deceptive AI is not there. And when you're talking about algorithmic management practices or even use case of some of the Gen AI, I think for me, the red mark is Gen AI cannot be used for healthcare. You cannot use general purpose technology for healthcare. And some of these, I guess if you're within the European Union, with the AI Act, very clearly this is a high risk area, but this is not true in the rest of the world. And I think when we think of it globally, we have to really think about what are the kind of mechanisms that we need to put in place. The other red line for me would be data collection is okay as far as it is for improving resource allocation, but it cannot be used for evaluating or punishing or disciplinating workers or fissuring the workplace. The second area is there's also a responsibility of the tech companies and the vendors, which we never get into a discussion when they are coming up with it, and computer scientists within it, and how they can develop AI systems that are far more responsible and which actually help in reducing some of the drudgeries that are there rather than trying to mimicking humans or using a lot of invisible human labor. And the third thing is the role of venture capitalists and their investments. The question is whether that can be regulated. And I think this is an important discussion we need to have because a lot of AI that you see is largely because of these investments that are coming from venture capitalists. The second area is around issues of skills mismatch and the issue of morals and ethics. And this is especially coming from Gen AI and all kinds of AI tools that are coming up. Because from a development perspective, it becomes important to see how this digitization can actually help highly educated workers to become catalysts for productive transformation and contribute to their economies and societies. Otherwise, it very clearly risks creating sweatshops of labor. So if we do think, going back to the development debate, that education is a silver bullet for productive transformation, how do you ensure that it remains that silver bullet? And I think for that, there's a very clear need to refocus on employment policies which link to innovation and technology to achieve that productive transformation and also having meaningful jobs. I don't think we need to get into the argument that some job is better than nothing, but I think we need to move towards how do we have meaningful jobs for the nature of education that we've had? How can we have a meaningful productive transformation for many societies and economies? And the third is issues around implementation and enforcement. I think even within the EU, where you do have a robust body of labor laws and a more developed social dialogue and regulatory institutions, we do find that there are negative repercussions for workers due to some of the algorithmic management practices in these countries, and largely because many of them are not implemented. And they're there and also not really enforced, and many companies do not even adhere to it. And that's, I guess, the whole issue. And here's where it comes up, how social dialogue and industrial relations are really important within this process, where you need to have consultation with the unions in the implementation of technologies. And there's some very good examples of work councils in Germany or the Nordic countries, but it's very limited. But I think we need to ensure also how unions would have appropriate technical, institutional, and operational capacity so that actually they can get into a conversation and deal with many of the challenges that are there right from the beginning rather than coming in later. And finally, I'd like to conclude by saying that very clearly there's a need for regulation. There's a discussion on regulating platform work next 2 years, which is very important. And I think we need to further see how do we ensure decent work in the BPO sector too. Within the algorithmic management, while specific regulatory action is important, at the workplace, I think we can also start thinking about how existing regulations and conventions can actually be applied within it. And thank you so much for listening. And with this, I'll stop.
Merci beaucoup, Uma. C'était passionnant et vraiment très intéressant. Je crois que ça ne fait pas l'ombre d'un doute. Je vais passer la parole à ma collègue Ségolène Journoux, qui a pour charge d'introduire et de lancer la discussion autour de votre présentation.
Alors tout d'abord, merci beaucoup, Uma, pour cet exposé et nous avoir permis de rentrer un petit peu plus finement dans ces différents impacts de l'IA sur le travail et de voir sous différents angles, effectivement, comment ça se passe, à la fois pour ceux qui développent l'IA, mais aussi pour ceux qui l'utilisent. Donc, on a pu voir ces deux facettes dans votre exposé de façon assez détaillée et ça a été très, très intéressant. Et peut-être pour ouvrir ce débat, je resterai sur votre dernière partie de l'exposé, hein, sur votre conclusion, pour aller un petit peu plus loin sur cet enjeu de dialogue social qui, pour nous, à l'ANAC, bien sûr, en France et aussi dans tous les pays, nous concerne beaucoup. Donc, on voit bien les impacts positifs. Alors là, on ne les a pas trop exposés, mais on les connaît bien. En tous les cas, ils sont plébiscités, hein, réduction des efforts, augmentation de la productivité, parfois réduction des risques, mais aussi négatifs. Et là, on les a vus, hein, le stress, l'isolement, parfois aussi une forme de passivité qu'on peut développer chez les utilisateurs. Et donc, la question, c'est vraiment vos recommandations pour les partenaires sociaux. Vous abordez un petit peu là ceux en Allemagne qui commencent à négocier, mais nous aussi en France, on commence à rentrer sur le sujet. Et parfois, c'est difficile pour eux, dans les entreprises, de rentrer sur ce sujet de façon efficace pour effectivement introduire au mieux cette IA dans l'entreprise, prémunir les risques, tout en favorisant son usage pour un travail décent. Donc, quelles seraient vos recommandations pour ces partenaires sociaux lorsqu'ils doivent se confronter à cette question si leur entreprise décide de mettre en place l'IA? Je m'arrêterai sur cette question, qui est déjà une grande question. Et puis, après, on passera la parole à nos auditeurs.
N'hésitez pas à poser vos questions avec l'option questions-réponses dans la barre d'outils.
Okay, should I respond to this from Ségolène? Is that fine?
Oui, s'il vous plaît.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry for this interruption. This is a very important question that you raised, Ségolène, about how do we actually go about getting the social dialogue off from the start. Now, I want to come back to something that I said and sort of try to give you some examples about how it could be done and how the work councils in Germany are actually going about doing it. Now, very clearly, many of these technologies that we are talking about, whether you're talking about the automated guided vehicles or many other things that are there, whether the electronic work instructions and all of it that is there. Now, what is it actually doing? It sets the pace or the rhythm, right? Now, that's where you can think about how you can actually intervene. Now, that might be set up at some 2 minutes or 3 minutes or 4 minutes. That's extreme because how are you setting it up? You're telling the computer scientist, I want efficiency. I want as much work done within the shortest time, right? So they're like, okay, if they want so much of work to be done within the short time, let's reduce it and let's put it up. Now that same pace and the rhythm could be set for a longer period of time, and they could also be built in a mechanism that they have breaks. And this is where, for me, the role of the unions becomes very, very important. This is the negotiating power of the unions on the shop floor, depending on each of those technologies, what is it doing? And one of the reasons is because you do not have so much of time, you also, get stressed and you make mistakes, and then all of that is recorded. If you had the time to do the job properly, you would not be stressed and you would do it within the given time. And I think that is, again, a part of the negotiation that needs to be done. So for me, I think it's not just negotiation right at the beginning, when you bring in technologies, whether it should be brought in or not, but also to understand right then, okay, what does this technology do? How does it help a worker? And then taking it in each of the steps of the production process, and then trying to understand, okay, how can we negotiate and set the timing within that? Now, and that would actually be beneficial for both the workers as well as for the enterprise that are there, and to have a regular break within that work process. Now, within Germany, what's very interesting, and we have seen through some of the others who have done studies in the automobile industry there, is that you have digitization, you have all these work processes, everything there. But the work councils in Germany are super effective in trying to use the GDPR very effectively and not allow for data collection on the workers. And that's exactly what prevents them from actually collecting data, and that cannot be used then for performance evaluation. Because the whole problem is, if all of this data is being collected to just look at certain parameters for the company, that's fine. But if it has implications on workers, then it becomes problematic. And this is exactly what some of the Nordic countries are doing. And there you have consultations far ahead right from the beginning. But we also have come across the fact that sometimes the technologies are being brought in, and often the company is not completely fully aware what are the different nitty-gritties of that particular system, and they also discover through the process. So probably that's where we need to intervene and try to say, can we have a discussion and a consultation process right at the beginning? And that would also require that unions need to be made aware of, build up their capacities, depending upon the respective sectors, and try to equip them to have such a dialogue.
Entendu, merci beaucoup, Uma, pour ces précisions. Alors, j'enchaîne avec quelques questions posées par nos auditeurs, notamment concernant la soumission des travailleurs au rythme des machines dans l'automobile. Quelle différence voyez-vous avec l'introduction de l'IA versus la robotisation? Est-ce que ça a augmenté cette soumission ou pas? Alors ça, c'est une première question, puis j'enchaîne toujours avec une autre. Avez-vous entendu parler du projet d'anonymisation des données de justice en France par les fonctionnaires? Annotation des données et donc non délocalisées. Donc ça, c'est par rapport à l'anonymisation des données, notamment dans le secteur de la justice. Voilà, deux questions pour le moment.
Can I have the first question again? It was not very clear. I have the second question. If somebody
C'est
can...
pas très clair. Oui. Alors, la première question concerne la soumission, entre guillemets, des travailleurs, la soumission au rythme des machines dans l'automobile lorsqu'ils sont guidés par l'IA par rapport à la robotisation. Est-ce qu'il y a une différence entre l'IA aux commandes et les robots aux commandes par rapport au rythme donné, aux cadences de travail? Est-ce que c'est plus clair?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I got both the questions now. I think about the workers being set with the pace of the robotics. That's exactly what is happening. So you have the automated guided vehicles, which are being used to actually set the pace of the workers. Now, what's very interesting is that you don't have these systems necessarily coming in Europe. So you might have many of these automobile manufacturers within Europe don't introduce it there, but they do introduce in their subsidiary companies or other companies overseas. So we have seen that in both Malaysia and Argentina, where you do not have really these regulations being there and these mechanisms put in place. So that raises another question around, when you do have rules and regulations in certain parts of the world, you can adhere to them and within your own, country. But when you go overseas, you bring in a lot of these robotization and a lot of these algorithmic management practices. The question that comes up saying that, can these companies also comply with similar systems in these countries so that you can ensure that the working conditions of these workers in these countries are also not exploited, and that can also pave the way for better systems within these countries? And about the second question on the judiciary in France and the annotation, I'm not aware about that. I haven't come across that actually.
Ok. Alors, autre angle que également est soulevé, c'est par rapport aux risques professionnels. On voit bien que donc l'impact de l'IA sur le travail et sur des risques potentiels. Est-ce qu'aujourd'hui, il y a un travail qui est engagé en matière de prévention de ce risque lié à l'utilisation de l'IA? Est-ce que c'est pris en compte aujourd'hui, notamment sur ceux qui développent, qui créent l'IA? Est-ce qu'ils sont sensibilisés à ces risques et les moyens de prévenir ces risques?
Yeah, I think this is a very, very important and a very good question. Whether those who develop these AI systems, whether they're aware of it. I think we've been doing some interviews with many of the computer scientists, and many of them are aware of it. But often there are two things that happen. Often they are unable to do anything about it because they're very clearly prescribed as to what the objective function is, which is more efficiency. So they try to actually lead to it. And many of them, as they try doing it, realize how exploitative this could be from a worker point of view. And many a times they actually leave the project and look for some other jobs or become self-employed. But there are others who don't really look at all these risks and just believe in the efficiency concept and go about actually developing these products. So very clearly, I think that that's one of the reasons why I said there's also the tech responsibility of the vendor, of the company that is producing it, and also the computer scientists who are actually engaged in it. And I think these are people who should be also taken up and to discussed with in trying to ensure that the kind of technologies that they are developing, they are actually not leading to major risks for the workers, and how you can build many mitigation strategies within it to ensure that workers are protected in the process. And many of it doesn't take too much of effort either. Like I was talking about the pace and the rhythm, for me, that's a matter of how do you set the algorithm, how often it has to come, how often the breaks have to be there. And again, trying to ensure that you don't need, and also some of the things you don't really need. Why do you need to monitor and surveil a worker on a regular basis? If there are faulty parts, which was there even before, you just find out what happened and then try to help the worker to be trained and ensure that that worker actually improves over a period of time. So I think there are mechanisms that can be done and put in place, and part of it is also a very clear discussion between the management and the unions with regard to putting in place a system that is workable to both. But this by itself doesn't mean that one is trying to say, okay, no robotization, no automation, no digitization. You can do it. Just do it in a very responsible way. You don't need to monitor workers in the way you're doing today. And that also speaks a bit about the trust in the system, because if your levels of surveillance and control are so high, that means that you don't, that means that, you know, the trust that existed between the management and the worker is completely broken down. And you're being suspicious about everything on both ends, both from the worker side as well as from the management side. And I think the question is also, how do we build that up? How do you actually build up the trust that is there within a company and try to ensure that everybody is working for that one cause? And then you can have much better systems that are beneficial to both sides of the parties.
Alors, une dernière question concernant, j'allais dire, le travail invisible et tous ceux qui enregistrent les pays et les données, pardon, dans les pays en voie de développement. Avez-vous des exemples quand même d'entreprises qui développent l'IA, qui utilisent des micro-travailleurs qui ne soient pas dans des pays en voie de développement, mais plutôt dans les pays de l'OCDE?
Yes, very much. That does exist as well. We do know that even content moderation was being done in certain parts of the US. And we also know from studies that have been done, even in France, that there are some micro workers that are there. But in many countries in Europe, if you start looking at who these micro workers are, they're often the refugee populations in these countries, or the migrants who are there, who are in trying to set up and trying to find a job, who actually get into it. But the proportions compared to what you see in developing countries are far lower. But based on the global survey that we did find these micro workers all around the world, both in the developing countries as well as developed countries. You also have companies that are set up in either Europe or the US, the micro work companies or BPO AI companies, but very soon the headquarters remain there and they have a very small workforce, but many of the workers are largely from developing countries. And this is increasingly becoming a phenomenon.
Ok, alors peut-être une toute dernière question, même si on arrive au terme de cet échange. Néanmoins, je pense que la question est importante, c'est sur le cadre législatif et la vitesse de développement de l'IA. On voit bien que l'IA se développe très vite, a un impact également plus ou moins prévisible sur le travail. Du coup, comment adapter au plus vite ce cadre législatif par rapport à ce développement exponentiel de l'IA? Est-ce que vous avez des exemples, notamment en Allemagne ou dans d'autres pays d'Europe, comment ils font pour adapter ces dispositifs à ce qui se passe dans l'IA et qui va très, très vite? Et après, on terminera avec cette question. Merci, Uma.
Yeah, very clearly, the way the AI is developing, I think we were all talking about the algorithmic management practices, and then you had the generative AI come in. And the question is, to what extent, you know, what can be allowed, what cannot be allowed, it's becoming a big issue. But even within that, I think the way the AI Act is, okay, there might be I'm much more talking about the EU AI Act. There might be quite a lot of limitations, but I think the way they go about identifying high risk, medium risk, and low risk, there are many things that are coming up that can get into those categorizations and can be used. But this again requires one to see what is the extent to which you can use. Here again, I would only think about Nordic countries and and the Work Councils of Germany, which are basically trying to use the GDPR and the EU AI Act and now the Platform Directive in a way to try to see how do you mitigate some of the some of the risks that it could have on the workers. But this is again something, a work in progress. I cannot say that there's something very definite that has been worked out, but there's a lot of thinking and discussions around that, especially when I'm speaking to some of the unions and some of the legislators as we move on. So thank you very much for these questions.
Merci à vous, Uma, et merci à tous pour avoir suivi et aussi posé ces nombreuses questions. Toutes n'ont pas pu être abordées, désolée. Voilà, mais nous vous remercions. Alors, à présent, nous avons une pause jusqu'à peu près 11 heures et puis nous enchaînons avec la suite de notre programme. Merci beaucoup.
On se retrouve donc dans une dizaine de minutes. À tout de suite. On a glissé de 5 minutes à peu près. Donc, on va reprendre les travaux.